they either had to sprint basically to get up and over the ridge to be safe on the other side, or they had to wait for the next day for the storm to pass.
The world's coldest unsolved mystery just got hit with new evidence, and it changes everything we thought we knew. For over 60 years, the deaths of 9 Soviet hikers in the remote Ural Mountains have haunted generations. Frozen bodies, strange injuries, and no clear explanation. Was it an avalanche, a secret military experiment, or something far more terrifying? Now, a brand new scientific study has surfaced, combined with declassified documents finally shedding light on what really happened that night. But what this discovery reveals is, in some ways, worse than anyone imagined. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. And if you're brave enough to venture into this chilling mystery with me, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the unexplained. It all began with what was supposed to be a routine expedition in January 1959. 9 experienced hikers, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, set out into the icy wilderness. They never came back. Weeks later, their campsite was discovered, but what investigators found didn't make sense. Their tent had been slashed open from the inside, as if something terrified them enough to rip their way out into a brutal blizzard. Most were barefoot, wearing only socks or light clothing in sub-zero temperatures. They had bolted into the night, leaving behind gear, boots, and the security of their shelter. Rescue teams followed strange tracks in the snow leading to the forest edge. That's where they found the first 2 bodies, frozen stiff beneath a cedar tree, barefoot, and wearing only underwear. A 3rd body was found halfway between the tent and the tree, seemingly crawling back towards safety. Then, one by one, the rest were found sprawled in snow, buried in a ravine, brutally injured. Some individuals had fractured skulls and shattered ribs with injuries so severe that investigators compared them to those sustained in a car crash. But here's what made it even stranger. No external wounds. Nothing on the surface explained the internal trauma. One hiker was even missing her tongue, eyes, and lips. Another had traces of radiation on their clothing. How could all this happen? Why would trained hikers behave like that? Soviet authorities quickly called it a compelling natural force. But what kind of force crushes bones without touching skin? And why were military planes reportedly flying over the region that same night? For decades, theories piled up. Avalanche, military cover-up, Yeti attacks, even UFOs. Each one trying to explain what led 9 people to die in such horrifying, unnatural ways. However, no single theory accounted for all the facts. The case was officially closed in 1959, and the area was quietly named Dyatlov Pass after the group's leader. But questions never stopped haunting those who dared look deeper. Over 60 years later, scientists returned to the case, armed with advanced simulation technology and newly declassified Soviet documents. What they found wouldn't just shake up the RS leading theory. It would reveal physical evidence long buried in the snow, evidence that could finally explain what really happened. But as you'll soon discover, knowing the what doesn't always explain the why. And the real story is far stranger than anyone expected. The campsite itself was the first sign that this was no ordinary accident. When the search and rescue teams found the tent, they were immediately disturbed. It wasn't collapsed by snow nor shredded by wind. It was sliced open from the inside. Think about that for a minute. Experienced hikers, trained in survival, willingly destroyed their only shelter in a blizzard. Instead of exiting through the entrance, they slashed the fabric open, seemingly desperate to escape something within, the tent. Outside, footprints told another confusing story. They showed people walking one by one from the site, not running away in a terrified mob. There were no signs of panic, no scuffles, and no external threat. But strangely enough, they were barefoot. Why were they barefoot at night in the Siberian wilderness with temperatures as low as 20 degrees Celsius? That calm, barefoot walk into death is one of the most baffling pieces of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Inside the tent, untouched clothing, food, and even journals were discovered. They also found a camera, partially damaged, which had snapped its last eerie photo, a blurry, overexposed image of bright lights against the night sky. Was it an accidental shot, or did it capture something else entirely? The area around the tent revealed strange burns in the snow. Some searchers later claimed to see traces of orange skin and grayish hair on the corpses, and leaked autopsy photos seemed to show unnaturally tanned skin on some bodies, possibly from radiation. But where did that radiation come from? Even more disturbing were the 2 bodies found beneath the cedar tree. Their hands were mangled as if they'd clawed up the bark in a frenzy, trying to escape or maybe trying to climb to safety. There was also evidence of a small fire, suggesting they'd tried to stay alive, but didn't last long. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent, face down, appearing to have collapsed while crawling. It looked like they'd been trying to return, desperate to make it back to shelter. But the final 4 hikers were buried deeper in the snow, and this is where things turned truly gruesome. If the tent told a story of panic, the bodies revealed something even more disturbing. Medical examiners expected to find signs of hypothermia, or even animal attacks. What they found instead were injuries that made no sense. On the surface, some victims appeared to have died of exposure, but others looked like they'd been through a war. One victim, Lyudmila Dubinina, had crushed ribs, a missing tongue, missing eyes, and part of her lips removed. Her stomach showed, signs she'd still been alive when some of those injuries occurred. Another victim, Semyon Zolotaryov, also had massive chest trauma. It was like he'd been in a high-speed car crash. That's exactly how the coroner described it. But again, no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises, and no broken skin. As for Nikolai Thibault Brignol, he suffered a skull fracture so severe, it would have caused immediate unconsciousness, possibly death. Yet, there was no sign of blunt force trauma from any visible object and no defensive wounds. Here's the problem. We have 3 hikers who clearly froze to death. 3 with injuries, consistent with high-speed trauma, 1 with facial disfigurement, and 1 with radiation traces on his clothing. No consistent cause of death, no common external injuries, no signs of struggle, and no explanation for how all this happened in such a short span of time in such close proximity. The Soviet autopsy reports were brief and vague. Investigators quickly closed the case, blaming an unknown compelling force, and sealed the documents. Even decades later, when researchers revisited the files, the confusion remained. How do you explain bodies crushed from the inside out without bruises? Why was only 1 person radioactive? And what could cause a healthy group of hikers to split up in such irrational yet strangely ordered ways? The autopsy reports were supposed to bring closure. Instead, they made the Dyatlov Pass mystery legendary. Deceased men don't speak, but in this case, their bodies screamed, and until now, we still didn't know what they were trying to tell us. As the physical evidence raised questions no autopsy could answer, another layer of the Dyatlov mystery began to surface, one built not on nature, but on silence. During the Cold War, secrecy was survival, and now, with declassified documents and fresh eyes on old files, investigators are beginning to see just how much may have been hidden. Sometimes what's left unsaid is louder than any scream. And in 1959, the Soviet Union went silent fast. The Dyatlov hikers were discovered under strange circumstances. But what unfolded afterward was even weirder. The Soviet government swooped in to take control of the investigation. Files were locked away, witnesses were hushed, and the official cause of death was buried under that vague term, a compelling natural force. When investigators found radiation traces on the clothing of 2 hikers, it sparked rumors that just wouldn't die. Where did that radiation come from? One theory suggests that the group might have accidentally wandered into a secret weapons test. Maybe they saw something they weren't meant to, a missile, a prototype, or even a chemical dispersal. That could explain the swift military response and why some documents vanished for decades. Even more intriguing, some of the hikers had military backgrounds. Zolotaryov, for instance, was significantly older than the others, a decorated World War II veteran, skilled in survival and fluent in code. What was he doing on a student hiking trip? Later, declassified documents showed that military aircraft were flying in the area that night. Locals also reported seeing orange orbs in the sky and glowing trails above the mountain. One of the last photos from the hikers' cameras captures a blurry flash of light, possibly a test flare or an unidentified object. But instead of pursuing these leads, authorities quickly closed the case. Was the search party somehow played? Did the state stage parts of the scene to conceal the truth? The KGB's influence is evident in the events that followed, including silent officials, restricted areas, and vague reports. Even the victims' families were cautioned against asking too many questions. One parent was told, "You wouldn't want to go missing too, would you?" Years later, when independent investigators finally got their hands on the original files, they discovered that whole sections were missing. Maps had been redacted, autopsy photos were tampered with, and some crucial data had simply vanished. If the hikers really died of natural causes, why keep the case under wraps for so long? The Soviet response only fueled the mystery. After decades of dead ends and speculation, the breakthrough finally came, not from a confession, but from science. In 2021, a group of researchers made a breakthrough that didn't just challenge old theories, it introduced compelling evidence that could explain the unexplainable. A team of researchers harnessed modern physics, computer modeling, and innovative avalanche simulations to publish a study unveiling a startling revelation. The hikers might have perished due to a rare delayed slab avalanche. This phenomenon, which no one had the means to detect at the time, featured in Nature Communications' Earth and Environment, was spearheaded by scientists Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin. What they uncovered was a perfect storm of circumstances. The group had set up their tent on a weak layer of snow. Fresh snow had been blown in by the wind above them. Then, in the dead of night, disaster struck as the entire section gave way, sending a heavy mass of snow crashing down onto their tent. It wasn't a full-blown avalanche, but it had enough force to cause serious injuries like crushed ribs and skulls. Fortunately, it didn't completely bury the site, which is why the tent and equipment were still visible days later. The injuries were consistent with those of Lyudmila and Semyon, severe internal trauma without any external wounds. This theory also sheds light on why the group made such a hasty escape, frantically cutting their way out. A moment of chaos that led to confused decision-making. The researchers even found inspiration in Disney's Frozen. Gaume, fascinated by the realistic portrayal of snow in the film, reached out to Disney's animation team. Their simulation engine played a crucial role in fine-tuning the calculations related to snow behavior at Dyatlov Pass. Believe it or not, Frozen helped crack a real-life mystery. The physics holds up. The simulation shows that even a small slab of compacted snow traveling just a few meters could deliver deadly force. It finally gave a scientifically grounded explanation for something that had felt almost supernatural for decades. So, case closed, right? Not quite. Even with this new evidence, not everything fits. The study doesn't explain the radioactivity, the missing eyes and tongue, or the rumors of orange orbs and military interference. It also doesn't account for why the tent was pitched in such a dangerous spot in the first place, something these experienced hikers would normally avoid. And then there's the emotional question. Why were they so scared they didn't return even once the immediate danger passed? The 2021 study is a turning point. It doesn't close the case, but it clears away some of the fog. It gives logic to part of the chaos, and it shows how far we've come in understanding nature's quiet violence. But even as science brought clarity, one part of the case continued to terrify. When rescuers uncovered the final 4 bodies, something about the scene rattled them to the core. And even now, in light of new studies, the details remain hard to explain and even harder to forget. This was one of those moments where even hardened investigators couldn't hide their fear. Weeks into the Dyatlov investigation, searchers discovered a snow-covered ravine nearly 75 meters from the cedar tree. It was deeper, colder, and darker than the rest of the site. Here, under several feet of snow, they found the last 4 hikers. But this wasn't just another tragic discovery. It was something else entirely. The moment rescuers uncovered the bodies, their expressions reportedly changed. One witness later described them as white as the snow around them, because what they found didn't fit any pattern. It was an insane discovery. Lyudmila Dubanina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. Her chest had been crushed so violently, her ribs had snapped like dry twigs. Semyon Zolotaryov beside her had similar chest injuries, yet no bruises on the skin. He still wore his camera around his neck as if he'd been trying to capture something before death. Nearby, Alexander Kolovatov's body showed signs of decomposition inconsistent with the freezing conditions. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and parts of his clothing were radioactive. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, the last of the group, had a fractured skull so severe, a coroner described it as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from great height. But here's the thing. There were no cliffs nearby, no trees to fall from, no rocks large enough to cause such injury, and again, no external wounds. It wasn't just the injuries. It was the way the bodies were positioned, arms entwined, faces frozen in panic. Clothing had been swapped between them, some layers removed and worn by others, likely from the first hikers to die. One wore 2 watches, another had a knife tucked into a boot. It felt like a last stand. But against what? Then there was the makeshift den nearby. Dug out in the snow, it looked like they'd tried to build shelter, gathering branches and laying clothes down as insulation. But whatever killed them had gotten there first, fast and merciless. When the investigators saw the state of the bodies, many refused to speak on the record. Some were later hospitalized due to shock. Others simply left the case. Soviet officials quickly stepped in, declared the investigation closed, and labeled the deaths as caused by an unknown compelling force. That's where the Dyatlov Pass mystery took its final turn into legend. Science could explain avalanches, and the Cold War could explain secrecy, but no one could explain the raw terror etched into those final bodies. It wasn't just how they died, it was the feeling left behind that something was out there, something no one wanted to name. And maybe that something is still out there. Decades later, the Dyatlov Pass mystery still refuses to rest. New simulations, declassified files, and evolving science have brought us closer than ever to the truth, but not all the way. And maybe that's the most haunting part, because even with modern answers, the feeling that something is still missing never really goes away. Yes, the 2021 avalanche study brought new clarity. It showed that science can reach across time and give logic to fear. But it didn't answer the full story. Not the radiation, not the disfigurement, not the secrecy, and definitely not the final expressions carved into those frozen faces. Was it an avalanche, a secret weapon, or something else entirely? Something we still don't have words for. In the end, we return to the same spot. The frozen tent, the torn canvas, and the barefoot tracks disappearing into the darkness. Whatever happened that night at Dyatlov Pass, it was enough to make people run from safety. It was enough to leave behind bodies the snow couldn't hide, and it was enough to make seasoned investigators turn pale and say nothing. We can conclude that sometimes the truth isn't just hard to find, it's terrifying. What do you think happened that night at Dyatlov Pass? Share your theories and thoughts in the comments below. And if this story left you with chills, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you up at night.